coming up.
Such a important, essential service as policing is, and we see that your department anticipates over $45 million in program funds will be left undispersed at the end of this fiscal year. Why?
Good. I have sat in phone conversations when the bureaucracy with chiefs, they didn't know I was there. They're pushing hard. I'm hearing the bureaucrats say no.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being here. I guess we'll just start with a simple, an easy one right off the hop to get into this, Minister. Just a simple yes or no. Do you believe that First Nations policing is essential?
Yes, I do.
Okay. I appreciate that, Minister. I appreciate the answer. That's not something we get very often around here. But you say that you believe policing on First Nations is essential. You mentioned in your opening comments that the government is committed to tabling legislation. Unfortunately, this is something we've heard for a number of years now. Your predecessor, who was rightly removed from his position at the time in 2022, said that he was going to work around the clock to get this done. He said that it was right around the corner. This legislation would be here. And since then, we've seen delays. The government at one point began blaming the AFN for dragging its feet, which was a ridiculous assertion in an attempt to deflect from your government. But now you're the minister, and the buck stops with you. So why should Canadians and First Nations across the country believe you this time?
They should believe us because there has been a considerable body of work done in this respect. I referred to consultations that our Assistant Deputy Minister Moran has had and her colleagues have had across the country. These are ongoing conversations. As I said, I'm picking up the conversation with the National Chief later this afternoon. I don't underestimate the complexity of this initiative. I participated in a federal, provincial, and territorial meeting in Bromont, Quebec, with provincial and territorial ministers. They obviously have different views as to how this legislation might apply. As I noted, it's a constitutional jurisdiction they have, but that doesn't mean that we don't have an obligation to get it right. And I know the suspense has been terrible for you, but I think you should look forward to seeing legislation, I hope, in an appropriate moment soon.
Thank you, Minister. Again, I appreciate that. I want to stress again the urgency, because 2022, this is 2 years ago that your government's been dragging its feet. Since the commitment, of course, you've had 9 years in government, so ample opportunity to move this forward. I had an opportunity to speak with your Deputy Minister at a previous committee about this process, and he mentioned that it is, quote, simply the struggle of co-developing legislation. So, Minister, why is developing legislation in consultation with First Nations a struggle for your department?
I don't obviously think that working in a sensitive and appropriate way with First Nations partners is anything other than the appropriate way that we should be doing this work. My experience with the department is that exactly how they're approaching this work. And as I say, I have a lot of confidence.
So do you disagree with Mr. Tupper, your Deputy Minister? Do you disagree with his characterization that this is a struggle?
I would never seek to disagree with a Deputy Minister as senior and as experienced as Sean Tupper.
So you do believe that it is a struggle for your department to work and collaborate with First Nations?
No, that's the word you're using.
That's the word that your Deputy Minister used on the record in committee.
But if you want to ask the Deputy Minister a question, you can. What I'm happy to tell you is that it's work that we're committed to doing, and the Deputy Minister and our officials in the department are doing, I think, very constructive and positive work. And he and I and Chris and others are going to meet the National Chief to continue this work in a little less than an hour from now.
Okay. Thank you, Minister. I'd like to move into some details of the report that you're here to discuss. Of course, there's lots that is concerning. For me, in northwestern Ontario, Treaty 3 territory captures most of my riding. And what's concerning in our local context is that Treaty 3, as well as 2 other police services in Ontario, have had to take the government to court. They are fighting for equal recognition, and all of this happening, such a important, essential service as policing is, and we see that your department anticipates over $45 million in program funds will be left undispersed at the end of this fiscal year. Why?
Mr. Chair, our colleague asked a number of questions, and
Just one question.
Well, there was a long preamble where you referenced some of the Northern Ontario work, and in fact, some of the police leadership that has most inspired me has been from Northern Ontario. So I have learned a great deal from some of the police leaders in your part of our country, and I think we should acknowledge that that is a part of the country that has seen considerable success, and we need to find a way to support them. With respect to the lapsing
I appreciate
of
that, Minister.
money,
I appreciate that, but
I was about to answer your question on the lapsing of money.
$45 million on the table. Why are you not spending this money?
So I was obviously, when I read the Auditor General's report, that was a source of concern to me. I discussed it with the senior RCMP leadership in the department right away. One of the challenges is this program is a cost-shared program. So our contribution comes at the end of the process, once provinces or territories allocate their own money. And in some cases, and I referred to that in my opening comments, in some cases it has to do with the RCMP's ability to staff a particular position in a particular community. So if that particular position is not able to be staffed, that's a separate challenge that we're making considerable progress in addressing, and I hope somebody asks us about recruitment and retention for some of these positions in Indigenous communities, because there's a good story to tell there. But you can see the challenge. The department is not able to allocate money to a particular position that is not filled, nor are we able to, under a contribution agreement, able to allocate money if a partner hasn't matched the 48%. So it's not, there should be zero money lapsed. So the way to get to zero money lapse, and we should increase the funding, which we're prepared to do, the way to do that is to work with provincial and territorial partners, and the RCMP improve the way they recruit and retain, which is well underway. So I'm confident that that number should be diminishing rapidly, but we do need to work with our policing partners in different jurisdictions to get that number to zero. I don't want to pretend that we alone have the ability to drive that number to zero, but we're going to work with them to get it to zero as quickly as we can.
Thank you very much.
Minister, you've got a long history in working with government, so here's a couple of questions for you. The length of the tri-part agreement, do you know the length of that agreement that's currently in place?
My understanding is they vary from different communities, so I don't...
I'm talking about the one that you and I know in our provinces, the tri-part agreement. How long is that agreement? How many years?
The framework agreement is a 10-year agreement, but there are different. Is that your question? I want to make sure.
The tri-part agreement that the provinces sign with the feds should be an easy answer. Should be. It's 20 years. I was at the table when that was negotiated the last time in 2012. That's a 20-year agreement you're talking about.
Sorry, I was just told by the Assistant Deputy Minister it's 5 years plus 5 years, but I think we should. I don't want to leave confusion at the table, perhaps, but we're happy to come back to that exact agreement with you. I don't want to leave...
Because it expires in 2032. It was negotiated and went into effect in 2012. It expires in 2032.
I'm sorry. Maybe, Mr. Chair, and if we're talking about the contract policing, I apologize. I thought you were talking about the contribution agreements with respect to First Nations and Inuit policing. The contract policing, you're absolutely right, expires in 2032.
And that's 48.52%, which goes to cover Indigenous people in a lot of provinces.
Again, I don't think that's accurate, but perhaps...
You've referred to it a number of times here today already.
But that wasn't the contract policing that we sign with provincial governments to provide contract. That's the First Nations and Inuit policing program, which is separate from the contract policing program we have with...
I'm going to go back to that. It's a 20-year agreement that you and I have our policing through. So when we talk about Indigenous self-administered, what percent of those contracts are 1 year? Your self-administered policing contracts you're talking about, what percent are 1 year?
Again, I can't imagine this is deliberate, but there's a significant, certainly, confusion, I think, at this end of the table in terms of the agreements with provinces and territories to provide contract policing services like in the city of Moncton where I have a house.
Right.
And then there's the First Nations and Inuit policing program. That's the 4852 cost sharing.
Yes, got that. As you said, we're moving into the other one, the one that you've made with Indigenous when we're talking about self-administered, what's the length of those contracts?
Mr. Chair, with your indulgence, I think the Assistant Deputy Minister might ensure that we all have a common basis of understanding with respect to these different contracts.
Thank you, Minister. There are two types of contracts under the First Nations Policing Agreement. There is a framework agreement with each of the provinces that FNIPP operates in, and those have, under the framework agreement, there are community tripartite agreements. But with respect to the self-administered police services, of which we have 36, those are separate agreements with provinces, the First Nation, and the federal government.
How long are those contracts?
Those contracts vary. They can be as long as 10 years, but it is at the discretion of the First Nation. So some of them, in fact, are 1 year.
Same as I was asking before. I asked how many are at 1 year, how many at 5, how many are at 10, and that's what I was looking for. Because we've got the main one we're talking about, you and I, we have 20 years in that contract, but we have none 20 years in those 38 agreements. Why?
So, perhaps, Mr. Chair, and it's a very good question, perhaps, Mr. Chair, I'll ask the department to come back to you with the exact number of years for the individual agreements, just so everybody has that information. But I think our colleague has identified, Mr. Chair, exactly the challenge that I tried to describe in my opening comments, because I think the point is absolutely valid. If in the contract policing between the province of New Brunswick and the Government of Canada, or a municipal police force that has the City of Toronto, SPVM, pick your municipal police force, that goes on year over year, that is the essential element that is not fair to the Indigenous policing communities, and that's exactly the issue that we're trying to address. So I think I share entirely our colleague's concern.
You've got it. What I'm getting back from those Indigenous leaders is that you won't give them the 20 years. They're telling me you won't go to 20 years. You're saying you're negotiating. That's their term. They're telling me you won't go there.
Again, there's a whole series of different contracts.
I got that, but I'm getting pushback from Indigenous chiefs saying you won't go to 20 years like you and I have. You won't go there.
And, well, that's exactly why, Mr. Chair, we think that it would be important to have the designation of essential services and the long-term funding, which it might be a 10-year agreement, renewable for 10 years, there's your 20 years, but they would know that their police services won't disappear and they'll be in perpetuity like in a municipality or our friends at the RCMP. So I share that concern.
Good. I have sat in phone conversations when the bureaucracy with chiefs, they didn't know I was there. They're pushing hard. I'm hearing the bureaucrats say no. So I hear that on phone conversations in person. I'm on. The bureaucrats don't know I'm there. The chiefs know I'm there, and that's why I'm there. Your guys are not going there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shields. And Minister, if you could actually submit that information to the committee on those 36 agreements, I think that would be very helpful.